welcome to the Rural Well. I'm Bridget, and I have with me Loren, and we are very excited to have you with us today. We are going to talk about generational trauma. Sounds a little scary, but there's a reason for it, and I am so excited about our discussion. So whether you are unloading the dishwasher, maybe you're supposed to be on a parts run, that's okay. You can be listening, or you might even just be in the school pickup line. Well, we want you to know that the industry has its challenges, and we're right here alongside of you in agriculture. We cannot wait to connect and inspire one generation and legacy to the next. So, Loren, how are you today?
I am fabulous, although I'm almost gnawing with anticipation because this is part 2 of chatting with Brian. And our last time we recorded, we were just kind of like, we felt like we just skimmed the surface. And so today, in our chance to chat with Brian, we are going to kind of drill down a little bit about that piece about trauma. Before we go too deep, I do want to kind of put a little bit of disclaimers. Trauma is hard. And when we hear about it, sometimes it causes us to have some reactions. And so if this episode is not for you, you can pause it, you can wait, you can put it on a shelf and come back to it when you feel like you are in a safe space to explore that. And we encourage you to reach out. You are not alone in this journey. And one of the strengths of the agriculture community is that we have a higher social capital. We can invest in one another. And so just know that as you're going through and you're hearing these stories and we're talking about some of those tough topics that maybe sometimes we like to push under the rug, so to speak. I think everybody heard me refer to farmers as ruggers one time, where we kind of lift up the mat, we sweep all the hard stuff underneath, and then we drop the mat, hoping it magically disappears. And of course it doesn't. So when we talk about hard things, sometimes we're lifting and peeking under that mat a little bit. And so I hope that you feel encouraged to do that today, but also know that it's okay if it's too hard or too fresh, and you need to hit a pause button for sure.
Well, we paused because our conversation was going so great with Brian Reisinger. He is the author of Land Rich, Cash Poor, that we realized we had to come back and touch on a few things. And one of them that was a theme that all of us realized we've sort of danced around but not talked about is generational trauma. And I'm actually going to ask you, Brian, how did that come across to you after the first time we visited? What did you reflect on?
I relate to what Loren said about farmers being ruggers. Farmers are also shoulderers, if that's a word, like you carry stuff. And when I first heard that topic of generational trauma, I got to admit, I felt like that wasn't me. You know what I mean? I wasn't like denying it to you guys in that moment. I've heard it in different ways and places. It had never really been described to me with as much detail and clarity as when I talked to you guys. And I sort of thought, I had a couple things rattling around in my brain, like, God, is that what that is? And then I was like, oh, that's not, you kind of have that reaction where it's like, that's not me. That's not us, and, but what I realized is it's, at least for me, it's just looking back at your story and seeing what it is that you're carrying as a result. And sometimes there's hard things back there. And, other people have other types of things they're carrying around. For us, it's that imprint of survival that our farm family had from the start. And I think there's a version of that so many farm families carry, and, I'll just real briefly for people who didn't see episode 1, I hope people listen to both conversations, but for people to know about me, I was 4th generation, and I saw my dad, this incredibly devout farmer, just carrying this forward. And I wrestled with myself not feeling like I was cut out for cattle and crops like him. And so I went off on my writing career and came back around. And although I'm involved in the farm, I always felt like I let him down. And so that's where I come to from this. And what I've realized is that in telling our story and learning about my great grandparents and my grandparents and my parents and their stories all along the way, I'm starting to see the pieces that I carry around, and that my dad carries around. And it's incredible. It's not just the strain of your own life. The idea that we come in with something from the get-go is it's a crazy concept, and it's a little scary, but I got to say that it's a little bit healing when I've thought about it too.
I think sometimes the word trauma scares people off. And so I'm curious, Bridget and Brian, when you hear the word trauma, why do you think it does kind of cause us to, close up or be like, oh no, that's not us. And we kind of breeze past it. Any idea why that would be?
So my first thought is always in the negative. If I'm going to hear generational trauma, I would suspect that we are carrying forth that trauma in alcoholism, rage, addiction, abuse. But what if that trauma that we're carrying forward isn't necessarily those things, but what if it's fear? Fear of being that generation that doesn't carry the farm forward? What if it's sadness that you feel is indescribable? Could it be different than just the first gut reaction?
I think that's so right. And I had that experience when I thought about it. Like, look, like I'm grateful to have had good parents. I grew up in a good home. We had a middle class living that was getting harder and harder and kind of slipping away. And we had things we wrestled with as farm families because of the things that farm families face. But I didn't face abuse growing up and things like that. So you kind of there's a little bit of looking away because we don't want to look, but there's also a little bit of like, well, there's a lot of people out there who deserve to use the word trauma. I don't know if I deserve to, I think there's a little bit of that in there too. And I think when you use the word fear, I do think that that's something that gets at another layer where there's a lot more of us carrying stuff around than we realize. And maybe that allows us to relate to people who have experienced types of trauma we haven't too, It's not about grading people's trauma, but there are different types of trauma. And when you talk about fear, I mean, I know people who've gone through the kinds of things that might have been on your list of trauma and on my list of trauma. And I think I understand them a little more, and maybe vice versa, if I just acknowledge some of my own, whether I thought it was worthy or not in the first place,
Worthy of being classified as trauma.
Right.
That's a whole thing within itself, because so many of us grow up with that farm mentality of suck it up, it'll be fine. If your life isn't that bad.
Yeah.
Maybe we just don't even recognize. And that's probably a question for you, Loren, is most of the time, do we recognize we're carrying that trauma with us?
No, we don't. And it's interesting because it is seen like a taboo subject. It's seen like you don't fall into that category unless you've had this like catastrophic experience in life. But it's not the actual trauma. It's how we process it. Right. So for some of us, if we've been in some sort of car accident, perhaps, we might be like, oh, wow, that was kind of crazy, but not so bad. Whereas others might process it as like, I almost lost my life. And so that's a very traumatic experience. So we need to show a little bit of grace to everyone. We need to be willing to say, it's not the actual trauma. It's how we process that. And we process things differently for different reasons. When we talk about generational trauma is actually carried down the DNA for 5 to 6 generations if no further trauma occurs. Now, for those of us who have experienced trauma as a child, so on the farm, if there's been a farm accident, right, or there's been a bankruptcy, a loss of a farm, or there's been a breakage of family line or breaking apart of family structure, that's a childhood experience of trauma and processed very often from a child's perspective as traumatic. And what happens is when we experience trauma as an adult, we have an amplified response. So yes, part of it is most definitely we're having a hard time reconciling the fact that some of our experiences were actually traumatic experiences, including chronic stress. Our brains interpret it like it's trauma.
Now you really got my bell ringing, and so I'll just briefly share like a through line I'm feeling, and if you guys want to dive into, as a writer who wrote a book about my family, maybe I tend to sort of try to encapsulate the story too quickly. So I'll just share what I'm thinking, and if you guys want me to drill down anywhere, I will. But I think about my great grandpa who came over from Europe, early 1900s, trying to make a better living. Where he was from was about to be torn apart by World War I. and he had family and other people who he was leaving behind to the trauma of war, and he wanted a better life, and he came here. And when he got here, he came here with a sponsor through a legal immigration system. We came through Ellis Island, but he had to hide for a couple of years. He felt because he had also signed a document with the German government that if war broke out, he would come back home to Germany and fight for Germany. And he got to America, and he didn't want to fight against America. He was building a life here, and he soon after had a wife. My grandpa, who was his first child, he had 3 kids. By the time World War I broke out, he had 2, and then with another year, he had a third. So he was raised in a family, and he was not going to uproot himself to go fight for a country that was fighting what was now his home. And that sounds like an experience that is so far away from my own experience in some ways. But when you talk about it in this context, it's like, man, like he was just like, it had to be every day. And everyone I've talked to and trying to document this story, it was just like, are we going to make it? You know, like him and my great grandma were like, are we going to make it? And I just can't imagine how alone he felt, you know? And then I think about my grandpa definitely carried that forward, because my grandpa grew up in 2 decades of depression, climbed the middle class. He grew up in poverty, working under a father who had to fight that hard to make it. And my great grandpa was a hard man. And not asking people to excuse him, but I'm also asking people to understand maybe why when you think about the life that he had, what he had to do to survive. So my grandpa came out of the Great Depression, and as a young man climbed into the middle class, and it's an accomplishment I'll always be in awe of, but he carried alcoholism with him through his whole life, and you can kind of understand that. Mm-hmm. And I think of my grandpa being re-traumatized by growing up in the Depression on top of what he carried in from my great-grandpa. And I think about my dad. You know, my dad stepped up at the farm at the age of 8 when my grandpa slipped off a corn crib and broke his back, you know, and so my dad, I can see ways he's been re-traumatized throughout life. And then I get to me, and so now it's just a crazy thing to think about. But like when I'm feeling in crisis, or I get into what we all call our family now survival mode, you know, where you're just sort of like in that crouch position, and you're like, damn it, I'm going to get through this, you know, and but you're not really understanding what you're feeling. And I can't relate to crossing an ocean. I can't relate to growing up in the Great Depression. I can't relate to my father thankfully falling off a corn crib and breaking his back. But I see how the things they felt, I think, boiled down to something I feel, which is what Bridget said, are we going to make it? You know what I mean? Like, I just think I can see and I can feel all that in a way that I wouldn't have if we weren't talking about this concept.
You said, I heard Loren say that you need no trauma for 5 to 6 generations before that sort of washes out.
Yeah.
Brian, do you feel like you're leveling down, like Dad was the peak, and maybe you're the next level down to start the generational trauma to subside? So the question I have is, Brian, do you feel that your dad was the peak of the generational trauma, and you're the next step down on bringing that down to a more manageable level, if you will? But Loren, I swear I heard you say something about how generational trauma is expressed, and I just want you to clarify that point before we have Brian answer.
Yeah, sure. So generational trauma, it does carry down the DNA for 5 to 6 generations. But one thing we need to be aware of is it's done so through epigenetics. And epigenetics are how things are expressed. It's one of the reasons why we have so much controversy over nature versus nurture when it comes to who we become. So, for instance, if Brian's dad, maybe he grew up in an experience of alcoholism, so he decides, I'm not going to drink alcohol because of my experience, he's transforming that trauma in that generation, even though it's still carried down the epigenetic DNA line. So trauma that's not transformed is trauma transferred. You can only do 3 things with trauma. You can transform it, you can transfer it, or you can hold it. And for a lot of our farmers, we hold it. And the other portion, of course, there is a portion of us that we transfer it. We blame other people, or, we hold it against other people. But you can transform it. It will still carry down the DNA line, but you also change some of those other epigenetics and how they're expressed. So I want to be sure, because sometimes I think we hear that it carries down the DNA for 5 to 6 generations, and people are like, well, I'm screwed, right? And my kids are all screwed. Now, that's not actually the case.
Yeah. I think that I see ways each generation has done one of those 3 things. And I think that what I would say is my dad is a generation that stepped it down some. And I don't think he knew that, but I always feel like Loren is reading our personal letters at our family when she describes these things. Cause what you said about alcoholism is exactly right. My dad, didn't like the taste of alcohol, didn't like the way it affected his dad, didn't the way it affected their life. And he never drank around us. And it was a long time before I saw my dad now see him have a Southern comfort, an old fashioned. Like, I think that was I might have been in my 20s before I saw him do that. And so I don't know that he would have articulated the way that we're talking about it here, but I think he knew he didn't want his kids to grow up with that. And so I don't know, because I don't know everything that happened between my great grandpa and my grandpa, right? But I think there was a lot of holding in the first generation, the second generation. And I think my dad maybe transformed that part of it, but held a lot of things. And I know I've held a lot of things. One of the things I've tried to transform without knowing I was doing that is, I got a little girl now, she's 1, and she just started walking, and it's hard to even talk about her without getting emotional. I'm not even getting into the trauma part of it, but I don't want her to carry around what I carried about feeling like I failed my dad, and so I don't know. I guess I'm trying to transform that, and maybe I'm doing that a little bit with the book and trying to lay down that story a little bit, but it's hard too, though. I don't know if this is a natural thing, but sometimes I don't want to say we want to hold on to our trauma like we actively want it. But there's parts of this story that I'm proud of. There's the resilience and the hard work and the way of life, and I wanted to know that stuff, and I wanted to know that about me and herself. But it's like I want to separate that wheat from the chaff. You know what I mean? And I want to I don't want her to feel like she's let me down. And I've got a feeling of living in both worlds a little bit, with being involved in the farm and telling our stories, but also having the life that I've built with my career and with my wife and in our home. And I don't know. Sometimes I feel a little bit like my great grandpa crossing that ocean. He left one world behind, and he was always part of 2 different places, and that's how I feel. And I don't know. I wanted to know this way of life, but I don't want to carry any of that stuff around. So if I can figure out a way to kind of clear the barn floor of that stuff, I will,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's so important for us to take just a quick pause, because your story is so precious and your daughter is so precious. And I think as farmers, we can come alongside one another and ensure that we know just how precious we are. We're not meant to live this life on our own. We're not meant to navigate it like we're walking on a steel beam, hoping to make it to the other side. And, Brian, I can confidently say is you have transformed that story. I confidently say that. And she will reap the rewards for your hard work and your transparency and your authenticity. And if our listeners get one little nugget of wisdom from this, is choose to connect with that piece of you that is really authentic, and choose to connect with others through that authentic truth. Right. Yeah. I'm appreciative of your sharing.
Sharing the whole book, the whole story. And so I have one last question before we change our tactics here. But my last question for you, Brian, is this: what has come from the writing of your book that has been either surprising or just so good you can't wait to share it? Because I would venture a guess there have been some surprises since the book release, things that you never expected would happen or reach out to you, etc.
I'll tell you, maybe I shouldn't have been surprised by this, but uh, I'm just amazed all the ways that my dad's story and my dad have been held up in this process. I wrote the book. I wanted it to be honest, and um, along the way, I told stories about things that were challenging about his and my relationship, but also things that I think really showed who he was and kind of what a hero he is to me. And but when you write a book and when you're going to put all that out there, you worry. At least I worried. How's he going to feel? How are other people going to feel once it's out there? Farm families don't really talk about stuff, like are people going to say, why are you out there talking about what you guys have been through, um, and so you just don't know what's going to happen. And the other week, something that showed this more than ever happened. I was talking in front of the Farm Bureau in Wisconsin. There's about 400 of them gathering. And I was nervous about this. I talked to a lot of people and a lot of groups, but this was a big group, one. And two, it was all farmers, all people like my dad. So all people who I think so much of and I'm so happy to be involved with now as we're trying to help American agriculture move forward, but also who I always feel a little bit like I'm not quite measuring up to. You know what I mean? I grew up farming and from these roots, but like, boy, these are the guys that have, and the men and women who have carried it forward. And so it's kind of like talking to 400 versions of my dad out there. And I was getting in my head a little bit about it. And I decided that what I was going to do was talk about the urgency of these issues and including mental health. But I was just going to tell stories about my dad from the book. And so I read a couple stories about my dad. And he was there, and he was sitting up there at the head table with the Farm Bureau leadership and our state senator. And this isn't the kind of thing my dad spends time doing. You know what I mean? Like, he's out there in the fields working, and here we are. It's kind of man of the hour kind of deal. And afterward, we were in the back of the hall there, signing books. And there were people coming up that were emotional, and that happens sometimes. And I'm so glad to connect those people when I'm talking. There's also a line out the door, and I was so grateful for that. And so I would talk with some people, and there was one or two people that if they were really looking emotional, I would talk to them a little longer, and then I would introduce them to my dad, and he was standing there, and he got talking to people. Next thing you know, people start asking him to sign books. And I was just so blown away by that. And it was just this moment where it came full circle, where our worlds were together. And my dad wasn't the dad that, felt like he was holding on to the farm on his own. Wasn't the dad who felt like his son didn't want to do what he wanted to do. He was there. I had written this book. People had heard his stories, and they wanted him to sign it. And there was a whole lot of healing that went on just that in that one moment,
Oh my goodness. Bridget, we just heard from, and he's on a future podcast as well, Dr. Ryan Burkhart. And he talked about this time when both his dad and him, his hands were wounded. Mm-hmm. And they were working on this wrench. They were hoofing this wrench together. And he said, I looked down and I saw this period where our blood kind of intermingled. He said, that might sound gross to some, but he said it was this place of honor and this place of like, just incredible. And that's what you just shared, Brian. Like, your stories have mingled to such a place where there's healing that's been experienced because of the sharing of story. Amazes me.
I see it as, what a way to honor your dad. Getting him out of his shell, getting him to tell his story, letting your dad have the limelight off the book that you did, Land Rich, Cash Poor. I don't think there could be a better way for you to honor your dad in what you're doing.
I appreciate it. What you guys are saying makes sense to me. And it's like, I'm honored that we got the chance to do it. And it is one of those things where I kind of joked in our last episode, how much processing I'm doing by writing the book. It's like, we don't get to write a book for every person that we need to heal with. And so I'm grateful that we've had the chance to live our story out and share it with people and work it out along the way. But it also just underlines for me how many more of those conversations I need in my life, and how many of our farm families haven't necessarily had the chance to pick their head up from the work and tell their story, let alone share it with each other. And just illustrates for me how challenging it is, because I think I admitted last time, there's things I ended up asking my dad and we ended up talking about that I don't know if I ever would have broached with him if I wasn't writing a book and trying to get to the bottom of things,
That's such an encouraging step for others to ask the questions. When your parents are gone, you can't do it now.
Right.
So Brian, in all of our discussions, we always ask and discuss a quote that we have, but you have the quote this time for us.
Yeah, it struck me kind of like lightning there. It's a quote by Winston Churchill, so I hope that our listeners will forgive me for quoting a leader of,
European.
yeah, like this is, but it's really apt. So he said, sometimes men stumble over the truth, but most pick themselves up and hurry off as if nothing happened. And I just feel that right now and through all these conversations, because it is like, he's kind of tongue in cheek and he's being witty about it, but it's like, how many times do we do that where you bump into something in life and it's like, oh God, you got to we'll get back to work. That didn't happen, and it's sometimes the most deepest truths that we do that with for any number of the reasons that we're talking about here,
We use that to hide things, I think, because I'm in the 1980s, my family almost lost their farm too. We got really close. But that is that little truth that everybody just stumbles over and says, oh yeah, things weren't going well. Dad almost lost the farm, but we managed to keep it together. There's a lot of cost to keeping it together, but it did. But you're right. We just stumble over that and just keep going on.
Yeah. Well, it's scary to look at. It's hard to look at. Sometimes you think there's strength in not looking at it. I remember, it's kind of like you grew up picking rock by hand. You kind of just like stare straight ahead, and there's kind of strength in doing that no matter how hot the sun is or whatever it is. And so I think there's different vulnerabilities and then there's different feelings of strength. There's all kinds of things going on, at least when I feel that when you kind of try to walk past something,
I think of sometimes my granddaughters, and when they stumble and fall or they've knocked their toes, and they sit with it for a minute and they cry and they look for comfort. And I think sometimes as farmers, we forget that step. Just as you said, Brian, few people really stop and pause. And instead, we just kind of keep moving and keep doing. And as much as we want to think that keep moving and keep doing is resilience, and in one aspect it is, so is the sitting, so is the seeking comfort, so is the fact that we recognize I am hurt and I am wounded. And you talked about that even a little bit earlier, when we talk about you kind of telling your dad's story. I wonder, I could be wrong, but I wonder if in a way that is a huge gift to your dad, for you to put the words to represent your dad, because so many of us in the farming community, we don't identify to rectify. We don't take inventory of what we're really feeling in order to kind of fix and make sure it aligns. And in a way, you kind of gave that as a gift to your dad. And I want you to know that that's something I encourage my farm families to do all the time, is to develop that language to help sort out those emotions that we feel. So when I think about this quote, I actually see it directly, working in parallel, in tandem, so to speak, with the story that you share.
Yeah. Well, I'm lucky. Maybe what I did is I stumbled hard enough to fall down flat on it, and we had to really
do something with it.
a while to pick ourselves back up. We didn't get a chance to hurry off this time,
Oh, that is tremendously true. Again, if folks haven't picked up your book yet, Brian, it is Land Rich, Cash Poor, Your Family's Story. Please take a look. As we were talking about even before we recorded today, that coupled with some others that talk about how we arrived where we are today in agriculture. Some may call it a farm economic crisis. We've already had those in the past. But more importantly, it's your story of your family and resiliency and hope. Now, we always bring in something fun to make us laugh just a little bit. So here we go. In the last year or two, think about something that you have loved to do, but recently felt that maybe you've outgrown or lost interest in. What's changed?
Jumping on a trampoline. Not going to do it anymore.
Was there an injury?
Maybe a slight display of humility.
That is an excellent idea.
No need to investigate that story any further.
Mine is one I think maybe a lot of farm kids experience. I would say feeding baby calves. Because I think we talk about my little girl and talk about kids and how when they feel something, they just express it. When you're a little kid, you love those calves, and then you get older. It doesn't take too long for sure by the time you're a teenager, but maybe a couple years before that, they're knocking the bucket over or they're pulling the top off the bottle, the nipple off the bottle and spilling the milk all, and you just pissed off at them for maybe a good couple decades. But I've come back around on it in the last couple of years because we started buying some young stock to raise up for beef, and I went out with my dad in the morning, and usually it'd be him and my sister, and I was helping out a little bit when I was back on the farm a couple mornings, and I just got a little bit of that joy back that you get when you're a kid doing that. So I recommend returning to bottle feeding, even though there's probably a lot of people listening to this who'd say no.
Been there, done that. Don't worry.
Last year, every time we had a bottle fed baby, we called our neighbor. We're like, "Hey, we have another one. Here you go."
I
was just like I can't do it anymore.
Totally.
Yeah. So funny. So funny.
If there was one thing in the last couple of years that I feel like I have let go of a little bit, man, I had structure, because for a long time, especially in my corporate job, I had everything scheduled out. I had reminders in my email. I had all these things. Now I'm a little bit more like, oh, I didn't get that done. I still want to get things done, but I've just found that I'm willing to be a little bit more flexible than I once was. Now, nobody's asking my husband that question because he might have a different answer, but that was my thought.
Sounds like some wisdom, if you ask me.
Hope so.
I mean, wisdom for you to be okay with not getting everything done on the to-do list, because those are a never-ending reality.
It never ends. So to both of you, to Brian, for sharing so much of what you have felt and gone through in this writing process, it's been fantastic. And I can almost see signs of relief in you for your own joy and mental health with what you've done. Thank you for sharing that. So, and to my podcast partner, Loren, thanks for today. We've had a great day visiting. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, everybody.